You've been told that being open makes you relatable, that sharing everything builds trust, that honesty is always the smartest move. But Carl Jung saw something most people miss. He understood that not everything true should be spoken, and not everything spoken remains harmless. Some information doesn't bring you closer to people. It quietly shifts how they treat you. Today, I'm going to walk you through 5 things about yourself you should never tell anybody, not because you're hiding, but because you're protecting something valuable. And the last one is the one almost everyone gives away without realizing it. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that is said awakens the counterforce." Let's start there. The first one is your long-term strategy. The moment you tell people where you're heading, something subtle but irreversible happens. Your path stops being private and starts becoming public property. People no longer meet you in the present. They measure you against a future version of yourself that hasn't even arrived yet, and that creates pressure you didn't ask for. Some people will question your timing. Some will doubt your capability. Some will quietly compare your progress to their own expectations. Not because they want to hurt you, but because uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. Carl Jung understood this dynamic deeply. He knew that when something isn't fully formed, exposing it too early makes it fragile. He said, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity." In other words, growth needs space, and space disappears the moment you over-explain. When you share your long-term strategy, people begin projecting their own fears, limits, and unfinished ambitions onto your vision. Their comments might sound supportive. Their questions might seem harmless. But slowly their voices start influencing your internal dialogue. You hesitate where you once felt clear. You justify choices that never needed justification. You start defending a future that isn't ready to be defended. And here's the part most people miss. Even people who care about you can accidentally sabotage your progress simply by watching too closely. Once your plan is known, every pause looks like failure. Every adjustment looks like doubt. Every quiet phase looks like inconsistency. Not everything grows well under observation. Your strategy needs silence to evolve. It needs freedom to change shape without explanation. Share results, not intentions. Movement, not maps. Because once your strategy is visible, it's no longer just guiding you. It's being judged, interpreted, and quietly reshaped by everyone who knows it. And that's a cost most people pay without ever realizing it. The second one is your deepest self-doubts. Sharing them feels like honesty. It feels like trust. It feels like letting someone see the real you. But once those doubts are spoken out loud, they don't disappear. They settle. They become reference points in other people's minds. Even kind, well-meaning people start adjusting how they respond to you. They listen through that doubt. They interpret your confidence through it. Carl Jung understood that people rarely hear words in isolation. They absorb them as impressions that quietly shape perception. He said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That process is internal. It's meant to strengthen you, not define you publicly. Your self-doubt is unfinished material. It's something you're working through, not something that represents you, but when you give it language too early, others treat it as a permanent trait. And here's the danger most people don't notice. In moments of tension or disagreement, people reach for what they already know about you, and self-doubt is easy to remember. It becomes the unspoken explanation for your decisions, the silent question mark behind your confidence. You start noticing it in small ways, less trust in your judgment, more second-guessing from others, more subtle advice you didn't ask for, not because people are cruel, but because once doubt is named, it sticks. Jung warned that unexamined perceptions control relationships more than logic ever will. Your doubts are real. They matter. They are part of your growth. But they don't need an audience. Work through them privately. Strengthen your confidence quietly. Because the moment you stop doubting yourself, the world may still remember the version of you who once did. The third one is how much you can tolerate. The moment you explain what you're willing to put up with, something shifts. People stop paying attention to how you respond and start remembering how far they can go. What you meant as clarity becomes a measurement. Carl Jung understood that boundaries are often tested unconsciously, not out of malice, but out of curiosity and self-interest. When you clearly announce your tolerance, you remove uncertainty, and uncertainty is often the only thing that keeps people careful. Once your limits are known, they stop being protective. They become negotiable. You start noticing patterns. Small requests become repeated expectations. Minor intrusions become habits. Things you once allowed once become things you're now expected to accept. And the most dangerous part is this. The behavior doesn't feel aggressive. It feels reasonable. Because in their mind, they're not crossing a line. They're operating within the line you already revealed. Jung observed that people often rationalize their actions in ways that benefit them. He said, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." That's why explanations fail where actions succeed. When you explain your boundaries, people listen once. When you enforce them silently, people remember. Your tolerance should be discovered, not declared. Let your reactions set the standard. Let consistency do the teaching. Because the fastest way to lose respect isn't having limits. It's teaching others exactly how flexible those limits are. The fourth one is your full self-assessment. The moment you start explaining who you think you are, people stop observing you and start judging the accuracy of your description. You might think you're being clear. You might think you're being confident. But self-definition rarely lands as confidence. It lands as a challenge. Carl Jung understood that identity is not something you announce. It's something that reveals itself over time. When you describe your intelligence, your self-awareness, your discipline, or your values, people don't absorb it as information. They store it as a claim. And claims invite testing. Every mistake you make suddenly feels bigger. Every hesitation looks like contradiction. Every human moment becomes evidence against the version of yourself you described. Jung warned about the danger of fixing the self into rigid language. He said, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." When you over-explain who you are, you trap yourself inside your own words. You start performing consistency instead of allowing growth. You defend an identity instead of developing it. And here's the part most people overlook. Once you define yourself out loud, people stop giving you room to change. If you evolve, they call it inconsistency. If you adjust, they call it confusion. But growth is supposed to be fluid. Let people experience who you are through patterns, not proclamations, through behavior, not biographies, because the strongest identities are never announced. They're recognized quietly over time. The fifth one is your inner motivations. This is the one people reveal without even noticing. You explain why you do what you do. You justify your choices. You clarify your intentions, just to be understood. But the moment your motivations are spoken, They stop belonging to you. People don't hear motives neutrally. They interpret them through their own experiences, insecurities, and assumptions. Carl Jung understood that intention is one of the easiest things to distort. He warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Most people aren't aware of how quickly they assign meaning to motives. They simplify them. They reshape them into something easier to judge. And once they believe they understand why you act, they stop paying attention to what you actually do. Your actions become secondary to the story they've built about you. If you succeed, they question your reasons. If you change direction, they assume hidden intent. If you stay quiet, they fill in the silence themselves. And here's the real cost. When your motivations are known, people begin negotiating with them. They appeal to them. They use them to influence your decisions. You feel pulled to stay consistent with the explanation you gave, even when it no longer fits who you are. Jung believed that much of human conflict comes from misunderstood intention. That's why silence protects clarity. You don't need to explain why you move the way you move. Consistency will speak louder than any justification. Protect your motivations. Let results do the talking. Because once people think they understand your reasons, they stop seeing your reality and only react to their interpretation of it. Oversharing doesn't start as a mistake. It starts as relief. The moment you explain yourself, something inside you relaxes. The tension drops. The uncertainty fades. It feels like connection. It feels like clarity. It feels like you've taken control of the situation. But Carl Jung understood that what feels relieving in the moment isn't always what protects you long term. He once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." Oversharing is often one of those things. When you talk too much about yourself, you're not always trying to be understood. Sometimes you're trying to quiet your own discomfort. Silence creates space, and space forces reflection. Explaining everything fills that space, so you don't have to sit with uncertainty. That's why oversharing feels honest. It feels proactive. It feels like strength. But psychologically, it often does the opposite. The more you explain, the more you invite interpretation. The more context you provide, the more material people have to reshape your story. You think you're controlling the narrative, but you're actually giving it away. Jung understood that most human reactions are unconscious. People don't carefully analyze what you say. They absorb it, simplify it, and remember the parts that fit their existing beliefs. That's why oversharing doesn't build security. It builds exposure. And here's the part almost no one talks about. Oversharing trains people to expect access. The more you reveal, the more silence feels suspicious. The more privacy feels like distance. The more restraint gets misread as withdrawal. You become responsible for managing other people's comfort with your inner world. But real confidence doesn't rush to explain itself. It can sit with being misunderstood. It can tolerate unanswered questions. It can let silence do some of the work. Oversharing feels right because it ends tension quickly. But restraint is what protects you over time. And learning the difference is one of the most underrated forms of self-control. Most people assume others update their image of you in real time. They don't. You grow. You change your thinking. You outgrow old patterns. But the words you spoke months ago can still be playing in someone else's mind like they're current. Carl Jung understood this gap between inner change and outer perception. He said, "Thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. People don't constantly reevaluate you, they rely on shortcuts. And one of the strongest shortcuts is what you once said about yourself. A single statement can become a permanent reference point, not because it's accurate, but because it's easy to remember. That's why explaining yourself too early is risky. You might move past that version of yourself quickly, but others may still be interacting with it long after it no longer exists. This creates a silent mismatch. You're responding from who you are now. They're reacting to who you used to describe, and the more you grow, the more frustrating that gap becomes. This is also why people feel misunderstood without knowing why. They assume the problem is communication, so they explain more. But more explanation often just reinforces outdated impressions. Jung understood that perception lags behind reality. Silence gives people time to catch up. It allows your behavior to rewrite old impressions without argument, because when actions contradict old words long enough, the words lose their authority, and that's something no explanation can accomplish faster than consistency. So what is the unseen cost of being too explainable? There's a point where explaining yourself stops helping and starts costing you. At first, it feels responsible. You clarify your choices, you give context, you make sure no one misunderstands you. But slowly, something shifts. The more explainable you become, the less authority you carry. Carl Jung understood that certainty doesn't come from words. It comes from presence. When you constantly explain yourself, you signal that your decisions require approval, that they need justification, that they're open for debate. And people respond to that. They question more, they challenge more, they feel entitled to weigh in, not because they're hostile, but because you've trained them to expect access. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That process doesn't happen through constant explanation. It happens through alignment. Here's the hidden cost no one warns you about. When you explain everything, you lose flexibility. Every reason you give becomes something you have to stay loyal to. Every justification becomes something you have to defend later. If you change your mind, it looks like inconsistency. If you adjust direction, it looks like uncertainty. But growth requires adjustment. Being too explainable locks you into past versions of yourself. Silence, on the other hand, leaves room to pivot without apology, room to evolve without contradiction, room to act without narration. People don't respect clarity as much as they respect certainty, and certainty doesn't argue for itself. It moves quietly. So how silence changes, how people treat you. The moment you stop explaining everything, people notice, not because you said something different, but because you stopped saying as much. Silence creates a shift in the dynamic. People become more attentive. They listen more closely. They think twice before assuming they understand you. Carl Jung understood that what remains unsaid often carries more weight than what's spoken. When you don't rush to fill every gap, others are forced to engage more consciously. They can't rely on your explanations anymore. They have to observe your actions, and observation requires effort. This changes behavior. People become more careful with their words, more respectful of your decisions, less likely to challenge you casually, not because you're intimidating, but because you're no longer over-accessible. Silence introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty creates caution. Here's something important. Silence doesn't mean withdrawal. It means restraint. You're still present. You're still engaged. You've just stopped narrating your inner process for everyone else's comfort. Jung believed that psychological strength shows itself through containment. When you contain yourself, people feel it. They sense depth. they sense stability. They sense that not everything about you is available on demand, and that changes the tone of every interaction. Silence doesn't push people away. It filters. Those who respect it lean in. Those who don't reveal themselves quickly, and that more than any explanation tells you exactly where you stand. Now let's understand when sharing is actually a weakness disguised as honesty. There's a version of honesty that isn't strength. It's reassurance seeking. It sounds like openness. It looks like transparency. But underneath it, there's often a quiet need to be validated. Carl Jung understood this pattern well. He said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing themselves." Sometimes, sharing too much is a way to avoid sitting with your own uncertainty. Instead of trusting your decisions, you explain them. Instead of standing by your choices, you justify them. Instead of letting silence hold the moment, you rush to fill it, and it feels responsible. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When honesty is driven by the need to be understood immediately, it stops being honesty and starts becoming self-defense. You're not sharing to connect. You're sharing to protect yourself from judgment. The problem is, this kind of honesty weakens your position. It tells people that their approval matters more than your alignment, that their agreement is necessary for your confidence, that your choices are still negotiable. Jung believed that psychological strength comes from integration, not explanation. When you're grounded, you don't need to narrate your reasoning. You don't need to convince. You don't need to clarify every move. Your calm becomes the message. And here's what changes when you stop using honesty as a shield. You become harder to sway, harder to manipulate, harder to pull off course with opinions, because you're no longer outsourcing certainty. Real honesty doesn't rush. It doesn't over-explain. It doesn't demand to be accepted. It stands quietly and lets the outcome speak. And once you recognize the difference, you stop mistaking exposure for courage and start choosing restraint with intention. Now let's get to the moment when silence becomes self-respect. There's a subtle shift that happens when you stop feeling obligated to explain yourself. At first, it feels uncomfortable. It feels like distance. It feels like others might misunderstand you, or even judge you for holding back. But over time, silence stops feeling like withholding. It starts feeling like protection, like self-respect. Carl Jung emphasized the importance of boundaries for psychological growth. He said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Part of becoming who you truly are is deciding what parts of yourself deserve space, and which parts are for public consumption. When silence is intentional, it communicates confidence without words. It shows that you value your own process more than immediate approval. It signals that your inner world isn't available for casual inspection. And here's what most people don't notice. The world often confuses constant explanation with competence. They mistake openness for trustworthiness. But in reality, the quieter you are about yourself, the more people watch closely, and the more weight your words and actions carry when you finally choose to share them. Self-respect isn't loud. It isn't about proving anything. It's about protecting what matters while letting the world adjust to your pace, not the other way around. That's the power of selective silence. If this changed the way you think about what you share, hit like. It helps this reach the right people. Subscribe if you want more psychology-driven breakdowns like this, and comment which part stood out to you most. Some ideas only work when you sit with them